Hello, everybody. Welcome to Chloethedev Unfiltered. Chloethedev here. I'm going to be finishing up the Nightshade paper from Near Protocol. From the Near Protocol, where they talk about their sharding design for their consensus protocol for the Near blockchain. Um, yes, maybe Mika's coming to say hi because I'm eating salad, having lunch, and I'm also waiting for a transaction to go through. I sent it with like 15.19 Gwei, and it's taking forever. It's been like 10 minutes so far. And the average gas price is like 15, so it's not like crazy, but it's taking a bit while. So I'm just going to get started. Last time I went through this paper, I got pretty much halfway through. I went through the first two chapters, so about 20 pages, and all I have left is to go through chapter three, which is still around 20 pages, but we're going to be really getting into. So the first two chapters were just the basics of sharding, the basics of state availability and data availability, and what are the issues, and what are the issues that Nightshade is trying to solve with these issues. And I'm assuming with the actual Nightshade now, chapter three, we're going to be jumping into how Nightshade solves these problems. So I'm pretty excited to go through it. I'm going to be looking over at my tablet from time to time. I'm trying to add liquidity for SLPF for Axie for my son's account. But I'm going to get started anyways while I'm waiting, and I might as well. So, chapter 3, Nightshade. Uh, 3.1 From shard chains to shard chunks. The sharding model with shard chains and a beacon chain is very powerful, but has certain complexities. Okay. In particular, the fork choice rule needs to be executed in each chain separately. Okay. The fork choice rule in the shard chains and the beacon chain must be built differently and tested separately. That makes sense. In Nightshade, we model the system as a single blockchain in which each block logically contains all the transactions for all the shards. Okay, so a lot of extra overhead, sorry, but let's see how that works. And changes the whole state of all the shards. Physically, however, no participant downloads the full state or full logical block. Okay, very interesting. Instead, each participant of the network only maintains the state that corresponds to the shards that they validate transactions for. And the list of all the transactions in the block is split into physical chunks, one chunk per shard. This seems like a really cool idea. Instantly, I see lots of issues where it wouldn't work in Ethereum, where you want to have just validators all over the place and coming in, leaving the network whenever they want. But if you had a set of nodes that weren't really leaving the network, that there wasn't lots of network churn, I could see this working out well, I suppose. Under ideal conditions, each block contains exactly one chunk per shard per block, which roughly corresponds to the model with shard chains in which the shard chains produce blocks with the same speed as the beacon chain. Okay. However, due to network delays, some chunks might be missing. Makes sense. So in practice, if a block goes by and some shards haven't proposed their chunks, then I guess yeah, so each block contains either one or zero chunks per shard. Because I mean, you wouldn't want two, because two would be, not consensus. Consensus could mean you have one idea for what the state is, or nothing because network latency, nothing. The message didn't come yet, but that message should be out there and it should be coming. So in the next block, oh, okay, I suppose you could get two blocks per shard potentially if in the first shard the block was chunk was missing and you might get two chunks in the next block. I'm not sure. Or maybe the next chunk will just contain the data from both blocks. Anyways, um, here's the beacon chain and here's the shard chains beneath it. And with Nightshade, what they're saying is the beacon chain and the shard chains are all moving in unison, I suppose. A model with shard chains on the left and with one chain having blocks split into chunks on the right. Uh, Mika, why? What are you doing? Okay. Anyways, um, so I guess with Ethereum, you do something more like the beacon chain with shard chains and all the chains kind of move with a little bit of a different state. With Nightshade, it seems to be a lot more rigid with how that works. Consensus 3.2. The two dominant approaches to the consensus in the in blockchains today are the longest or heaviest chain, in which the chain that has the most work or stake used to build it is considered canonical. In BFT, in which for each block, some set of validators reach a BFT consensus. Okay. In the protocol proposed recently, the latter is a more dominant approach, since it provides immediate finality. Okay. While the longest chain, more blocks to be while in the longest chain, more blocks need to be built on top of the block to ensure finality. The two dominant approaches in consensus today are the longest and BFT. Okay, yes. Okay, sorry. I lost track of what I was reading for a second. Anyways, often for a meaning, often for a meaningful security, the time it takes for a sufficient number of blocks to be built takes on the order of hours. I understand what it's saying. I don't. Okay, anyways. Using BFT consensus on each block also has advantages, such as BFT consensus involves considerable amount of communication, while recent advances allow the consensus to be reached in linear time in number of participants, see some example, it is still noticeable overhead per block. Oh, so saying that has disadvantages. Sorry, see, I think maybe it's just too. Anyways, sorry. I think having the music on at the same time is distracting me. But anyways, actually, how big is my? There we go. Now I can see what I'm reading. Okay, using BFT consensus on each block also has disadvantages, such as BFT consensus involves considerable amount of communication. So like different, like you have different pub sub, like approaches, but they all would require considerable overhead. So in ETH2, they had to increase the slot time from like double it. For these overhead reasons, it is unfeasible for all the network participants to participate in the BFT consensus per block. Thus, usually only a randomly sampled subset of participants reach the consensus. So it's kind of like, again, those same overhead issues make it so that it's unreasonable for every single node to vote at the same time. So it's kind of like you're also sharding out the votes by randomly choosing who votes or who attests in each block. A randomly sampled set can be, in principle, adaptively corrupted, and a fork, in theory, can be created. The system either needs to be modeled to be ready for such an event and thus still have a fork choice rule besides the BFT consensus, or be designed to shut down in such an event. It is worth mentioning that some designs, such as Algorand, significantly reduce the probability of adaptive corruption. I would like to know how really quick, but I'm not going to dig into the Algorand paper. Most importantly, the system stalls if 1/3 or more of all the participants are offline. Thus, any temporary network glitch or a network split can completely stall the system. Makes sense? Ideally, the system must be able to continue to operate for as long as at least half of the participants are online. The heaviest chain-based protocols continue operating even as less than half the participants are online, but the desirability of this property is more debatable within the community. I guess Ethereum kind of uses, definitely weight-based, not heaviest chain-based, but they're going to be moving from or like longest chain, but it's like a mix of the two, right? You have Ghost where it's like, okay, you put weight on these blocks, and then you pick the longest chain with the longest weight, and then eventually you finalize that, and it never changes. So you have some finality, and you keep building these blockchains on top of this like new Genesis block because you've got some finality again on that. So once you have finality, it's like that's the new Genesis block. You build some work you build on top of it, and you vote for what the state should be, and then you just keep choosing the heaviest block each time, preferably. Yeah, so a hybrid model. Oh yeah, this is Casper. All that. Oh, Polkadot uses Grandpa. I should read that next. A hybrid model in which the consensus used is some sort of the heaviest chain, but some blocks are periodically finalized using the BFT finality gadget maintain the advantages of both models. Yeah. So such BFT finality gadgets are Casper FFG using Ethereum 2.0, which I guess that would be now Ghost. I think. Sorry, Gasper, which combines Casper and Ghost into what I think is more closely what's going to be used in Ethereum 2.0, which I did a review on this channel. Casper CBC. There's this friendly finality gadget, and then I can't even remember what this one is. But I might go through Grandpa. Let's see. I might read it one day. If it's not about Ethereum, it's just so hard to keep track. With Near, I get into it because I'm working with Mintbase, hopefully, and doing a lot of cool art stuff with them. And I'd like to know what the consensus is for the art that I might have on that chain, or the consensus for the state. But when it comes to like Polkadot and stuff, I'm not gonna use Polkadot probably. Nightshade uses the heaviest chain consensus. Specifically, when a block producer produces a block, see section 3.3, they can collect signatures from other block producers and validators attesting to the previous block. Okay. And then it's going to show us in section 3.8 how such large number of signatures are aggregated. The weight of a block is then the cumulative stake of all the signers whose signatures are included in the block. The weight of a chain. Hey Google, stop music. I was playing music because the dog gets kind of anxious when it's quiet in here, but it's so distracting when I'm trying to read and listen to it at the same time. I don't know if you people do that, but I know people code and listen to music and stuff, but I need just silence when I read and I listen to myself. It's kind of how I I kind of visualize all of this in my head, and that's kind of how I understand or try and understand it. The weight of a chain is the sum of the block weights. On top of the heaviest chain consensus, we use a finality gadget that uses the attestations to finalize the blocks. To reduce the complexity of the system, we use a finality gadget that doesn't influence the fork choice rule in any way, and instead only introduces extra slashing conditions. Okay. Such that once a block is finalized by the finality gadget, a fork is impossible unless a very large percentage of the total stake is slashed. Okay. Casper CBC is such a finality gadget. So, okay. And we present the model with Casper CBC in mind. Oh, well, now I have to read Casper CBC because I've only read Casper FFG. And now I'm like, oh, so there's something, this is like a different spin off of what, like, the route that Ethereum took. Interesting. We also work on a separate BFT protocol called TXFlow. At the time of writing this document, it is unclear if TXFlow will be used instead of Casper CBC. We note, however, that the choice of the finality gadget is largely orthogonal to the rest of the design. So they're saying that how you get finality isn't that big of a deal. What's more important it's very true, it's how you are achieving consensus in the first place to get to that finality. Okay, block production. In Nightshade, there are two roles, block producers and validators. Pretty normal. At any point, the system contains W block producers. So W equals 100 in our models, and WV validators in our model, V equals 100. So therefore, WV equals 100,000. So I guess that if you're a validator, you get to be a block producer like 1 in 100 times or something. I don't know. The system is proof of stake, meaning that both block producers and validators have some number. Are they different in this? Okay, have some number of internal meaning that both block produces. Okay, sorry, some sort of number of internal currency referring to as token lock. Okay, yes, it's we're staking. I get it. Um, Far exceeding the time they spent performing the duties of building the validator chain. As with all the proof of stake systems, not all the block producers and not all the you know validators that are also block producers are different entities, since that cannot be enforced. Each of the block producers and the validators, however, do have a separate stake. Okay. Interesting. See, this is very, very different than what you have in Ethereum. Let me keep going because I think they're going to explain themselves in a second. The system contains n shards. So n equals 1,000 in their model. So you have 1,000 shards, 100, like, anyways. As mentioned in section 3.1, in Nightshade, there are no shard chains. Just one. Instead, all the block producers and validators are building a single blockchain, but like it's like a web, I guess, that we refer to as the main chain. The state of the main chain is split exactly. So the state of the chain is split into n shards. And each block producer and validator at any moment only have downloaded locally a subset of the state that corresponds to some subset of the shards. So basically, there's this, instead of having like all these different shards that are these own different like localized areas, it's almost as if with Near, you have, you know, it's almost like having once, instead of having like a huge world like Ethereum, where you have all these cities that aren't connected, but they all speak like the same language. They all have the internet, so you can't connect to each city, but they all go to the internet together. It's kind of how like Ethereum would be with a beacon chain and the main keeping things going, and then each city is its own shard, and they can kind of connect to the beacon chain, but can't connect to each other yet. In this, it seems like it's more like everyone lives in one city, but there's like different, like everyone lives within their own dimension, and like you only care about your own dimension, and so you only care about your own state, or each node only care about the own state that it needs to care about. And it only processes and validates transactions that affect those parts of the state. To become a block producer, a participant of the network locks some large amount of tokens, a stake. The maintenance of the network is done in epochs, where an epoch is a period of time on the order of days. Okay, so epochs are days. The participants with the W largest stakes at the beginning of a particular epoch are the block producers for that epoch. Each block producer is assigned to some number of shards, say it's 40, which would make, there's 4 block producers per shard. Okay, yeah, there's 100 shards, fine. Or 1,000 shards, or yeah, anyways. The block, okay, so there's 4 block producers per shard, so you'd assume that even if 3 block producers went offline, they'd get slashed heavily, and you'd hope that 4 is enough. Okay. The block producer downloads the state of the shard they are assigned to before the epoch starts. So let's say you have some state for a shard that you're assigned to, download it before the epoch, which is a few days, and throughout the epoch collects transactions that affect that shard and applies them to the state. And then so over the next couple of days, it's doing the same job, but just doing it for a long period of time. Okay. For each block B on the main chain, and for every shard S, there's one of the assigned block producers, S, who is responsible to produce the part of B, the block B, related to the shard. So only one of the assigned block producers is responsible for producing the part of the block for that shard. The part of B related to the shard S is called a chunk. So only one block producer is responsible to produce the chunk out of the four, and contains the list of the transactions for the shard to be included in B, the block, as well as the Merkle root of the resulting state, so you could verify it. B, this block, will ultimately only contain a very small header of the chunk, namely the Merkle root of all applied transitions. So they're only keeping the data that the hash of all the different changes to the state. That block is not carrying much data at all. So you're trusting the block producer to produce. Basically, they're just producing a proof saying this information is true. So they download the information, verify it, and submit a proof. Throughout the rest of the document, we often refer to the block producer that is responsible to produce a chunk at a particular time for a particular shard as a chunk producer. So you have the block producers, which there's four of them, and then there's only one who's producing the chunk. That's the chunk producer, a 1 in 4 shot, it seems. And this seems like, so it's the heaviest stake weight for those shards. So if you're interested in those shards and you're staking for those shards, I guess you have a higher chance of producing for those shards, but maybe you could always, I don't know. Maybe it's randomly dispersed. I'm not really sure. It seems like in this blockchain, it's very important to have more tokens, whereas in Ethereum, arguably, it's not really more helpful to kind of hoard the tokens for yourself. So this is more the issue I see with this blockchain. But again, it's not, this Near isn't really meant to be this global state layer, so not that important potentially. The block producers and the chunk producers rotate each block according to a fixed schedule. Okay, so they try and make it fair, maybe? Let's see. The block producers have an order and repeatedly produce blocks in that order. Okay, so they do it in the same order all the time. Okay. For example, if it's 100 block producers, the first block producer is responsible for producing blocks 1, 101, 201, etc. So at least you know when when it's your turn. Could be like some overhead issues there, but I feel like if you know when it's your turn, can't you just cheat? Maybe you can't. Anyways, since chunk production, unlike the block production, requires maintaining the state, and for each shard, only SW over N block producers maintain the state for shards, right? Correspondingly, only those specific block producers rotate to create chunks. So, for example, with the constants above, with 4 block producers assigned to each shard, each block producer will be creating chunks once every 4 blocks. Okay, so basically, which makes sense. I guess my thing was, I guess blocks are pretty quick in Near, so I'm thinking like, I don't know why. I'm thinking like, how can you game the system if you knew when you're producing blocks? But again, they said in this example, you only do it every 4. You're not gonna have that much latency, and you're just gonna keep it on. But it's actually reducing your overhead because instead of always having to produce blocks, you're only doing it once. I think with Ethereum, you propose once a epoch, but you would test every slot. I think I lose track. I keep reading. That's why also I like trying to only read Ethereum stuff. I like branching out and learning more, but it's hard to keep track of what's for what blockchain and what's just a paper and what's actually going in. And so I want to kind of focus more on what's actually going into Ethereum. And so on Sundays, actually, a new series I'm going to start doing is I'm just going to start just digging into the ETH research blog forum. And so every Sunday, my goal is to go for like just an hour and just dig through it and just kind of make sure I'm keeping up with everything that's going on. So 3.4, ensuring data availability. So this is always where I kind of get into when I kind of start looking into like blockchain or layer two solutions or scalability solutions. It's like, okay, well, you have trade-offs, right? So if you're going to increase scalability or increase security even, um, what are you losing out on? So to ensure the data availability, we use an approach similar to that of Polkadot described in section 2.5.3. Once a block producer produces a chunk, they create an erasure coded version of it with an optimal, W over 6+1 block code of the chunk. They then send one piece of the erasure coded chunk. We call such pieces chunk parts or just parts to each block producer. Oh, this is so cool. So they're pretty, okay, I'm gonna keep going. We compute a Merkle tree that contains all of the parts as the leaves, and the header of each chunk contains the Merkle root of such tree. The parts are sent to the validators via one part messages. Each such message contains just the chunk header, the original, so it contains the chunk header, the original part, and the part contents. The the coordinates of the part and the part content. So I guess it could be verified. The message also contains the signature of the block producer who produced the chunk and the Merkle path to prove that the path corresponds to the header. So basically, this is what the proof contains. So the validators can prove the validity. So this is all happening, and so in Ethereum, it seems as though all the validators are also block producers, and it's all one shared thing. Here, it seems like you have block producers, and you have all these validators who are like, is this right? Is this right? Is this right? Is this right? And all the block producers have to do all the overhead of proving everything to the world. I kind of like this idea, and I think we're going to see a similar idea in Ethereum anyways. But with Ethereum, I do agree that you need as many nodes as possible. With Near, potentially not as important. Once a block producer receives a main chain body, they first check if they have one part messages for each chunk included in the block. If not, the block is not processed until the missing one part messages are received. So no blocks are processed until all the chunks can be verified. Once all the one part messages are received, the block producer fetches the remaining parts from the peers and reconstructs the chunks for which they hold the state. Very interesting. So once it's all received, the block producer fetches the remaining parts from the peers. Oh gosh. The block producer doesn't process a main chain block for at least one chunk included in the block. They don't have the corresponding one part message. So this is saying when it doesn't process. If for at least one chunk included in the block, they don't have a corresponding message, or if for at least one shard of which they maintain the state, they cannot re-instruct the entire chunk. Okay, so basically saying again, the block producer doesn't process the block if they can't do either of these two things. Not that complicated. They need to verify everything before they produce a block to the main chain. For a particular chunk to be available, it is enough that W over 6+1 of the block producers have their parts and serve them. So what W was the block producers. So what? So as long as malicious actors don't exceed half. So as long as what? 1/3 of the producers. Okay, so I guess it depends how many malicious actors you have. So thus, for as long as the number of malicious actors doesn't exceed W over 3, which 1/3, no chain that has more than half block producers building it can have unavailable chunks. Yeah. the viewers. The chunk to be available is enough that. But yeah, so this is just informational theory. I'm just gonna like work through it with my brain so I can keep understanding the informational theory. But just saying that if people are following the consensus rules, or if nodes are following the consensus rules, um, you know the chunk is available if more than half of the nodes are being honest and available, and you should be able to move forward. As long as, again, more than one third are not being malicious and over half are available. So those are kind of the numbers, like one third and half. You need both of those to move forward. So you have the main chain block, you have the chunks, everything's erasure coded, so you can try to make sure everything's verified. Figure 17, each block contains 1 or 0 chunks per shard, and each chunk is erasure coded. Each part of the erasure coded chunk is sent to a designated block producer via a special one part message. Okay. Dealing with lazy block producers. If a block producer has a block for which a one part message is missing, they might choose to still sign on it. Because if the block ends up being on chain, it will maximize the reward for the block producer. There's no risk for the block producer since it is impossible to prove later that the block producer didn't have the one part message. That's not good. To address it, we make each chunk producer, when creating the chunk, to choose a color, red or blue, for each part of the future encoded chunk, and store the bit mask of assigned color in the chunk before it is encoded. Each one part message then contains the color assigned to the part, and the color is used when computing the Merkle root for the encoded parts. If the chunk producer deviates from the protocol, it can be easily proven since either the Merkle root will not correspond to one part messages, or the colors in the one part messages that correspond to the Merkle root will not match the mask in the chunk. Is this just like using, why red or blue though? Sorry, like these are the times that I'm assuming it's supposed to be 0 or 1, and you just like, you just, but why red or blue? Maybe to make it easier for like true or false, red or blue, one or like 0 or 1. But anyways, red or blue is fine. And you'll be able to know who's not following the protocol based on not choosing the assigned color, I would assume. When a block producer signs on a block, they include a bit mask of all the red parts they received for the chunks included in the block. Publishing an incorrect bit mask is a slashable behavior. I guess red or blue gives you more data than true or false, because zeros will give you 0 and 1 will give you 1, but even still, I think like 0 and 1 would give you a correct number, but maybe they don't want it to be a number. Anyways, I'm going to keep going. If a block producer hasn't received a one part message, they have no way of knowing the color of the message, and thus have a 50% chance of being slashed if they attempt to blindly sign the block. And that's what I'm saying. It's just about creating a little bit of extra probability of getting slashed until they're not worth it. 50-50 shot, taking a little bit of profit and lose a lot of money isn't worth it. So all you really need to do is add a 0 or a 1. But red or blue is just fine, and maybe zeros caused issues in like the math, and they wanted both of them to be numbers instead of having a 0. And I understand completely because math is annoying, and so. But again, these are the kind of things I'd like to read, like why red or blue, and like all that kind of stuff. But anyways, 3.5 state transition application. The chunk producers only choose which transactions to include in the chunk, but do not apply the state transition when they produce a chunk. Makes sense? Only the specific block producer that's no. Oh, okay. Yeah. Correspondingly, the chunk header contains the Merkle root of the Merkleized state as of before the transactions in the chunk are applied. The transactions are only applied when a full block that includes the chunk is processed. Our participant only processes a block if the previous block was received and processed. For each Anyway, sorry. For each chunk, the participant doesn't maintain the state for they have seen the one part message. For each chunk, the participant doesn't maintain the state for. Okay, sorry. For each chunk, the participant doesn't maintain the state for, they have seen the one part message. And for each chunk, the participant does maintain the state for, they have the full chunk. Okay. Then once the block is being processed, for each shard for which the participant maintains the state for, they apply. Who's they? A participant only proposes a block, so a block proposer. So it should be W, I suppose. So a block proposer only proposes a block if the previous block was received and processed, so the previous block is valid, and these two are happening. Then once the block is I guess done being processed, because you process it, and then once it's done being processed, for each shard for which the block producer is in charge for, they imply the transitions and compute the new state as of and compute the new state. Okay. After that, they are ready to produce the chunks for the next block if they are assigned to any shard. Since they have the Merkle root of the new Merkleized state. Okay, so they only process it if all those things are true, but they only have the old state to do so. They take the old state, see if those things are true, do the straight transition, and then they're ready for the next to produce the chunk for the next block. Yeah. Okay. This was a lunch and learn or whatever series on YouTube they had, where they went over this. They talked about one block cross shard transactions. It was very interesting, and that's what made me want to just read it because I was like, you're explaining all this and it's great, but it'd be easier if I read all of it. And there's quite a lot more to go through. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. We're almost halfway through though, which is good. Okay. Let me start drinking some water because my transaction probably went through. Wait a second. Okay, hold up. It's been 51 minutes since I sent the transaction. And now it's okay, well, I mean, the gas was a bit low, not gonna lie. Okay. Cross shard transactions and receipts. If a transaction needs to affect more than one shard, it needs to be consecutively executed in each shard separately. The full transaction is sent to the first shard affected, and once the transaction is included in the chunk for such shard and is applied after the chunk is included in a block, it generates a so-called receipt transaction that is routed to the next shard in which the transaction needs to be executed. If more steps are required, the execution of the receipt transaction generates a new receipt transaction, and so on. 3.6.1 Receipt Transaction Lifetime. It is desirable that the receipt transaction is applied in the block that immediately follows the block in which it was generated. You don't want to wait forever for the receipt transaction to appear. The receipt transaction is only generated after the previous block was received and applied by block producers that maintain the originating shard, and needs to be known by the time the chunk for the next block is produced by the block producers of the destination shard. Thus, the receipt must be communicated from the source shard to the destination shard in the short time frame between those two events. Let A be the last produced block which contains a transaction T So let A be the last produced block, which contains a transaction T that generates a receipt R. Let B be the next produced block. So you have block A, block B, for i.e. a block that has A as a previous block. That we want to contain R. We want this receipt to be in B so we can cross shard. I think let T be in the shard A and the receipt be in the shard B. So yeah, A and B are different shards, but they're at different times, and you're trying to get the receipt to appear in the next shard. Sorry, the next block in the next shard. The lifetime of the receipt, also depicted on figure 18, is the following. Producing and storing the receipts. The chunk producer, which CPA, I guess, for shard A, so chunk producer for shard A, receives the block A, applies the transaction T, and generates the receipt R. So it's all happening great in A. The chunk producer for A then stores all such produced receipts in its internal persistent storage indexed by the source shard ID. Distributing the receipts. Once the chunk producer for block A is ready to produce the chunk for shard A, for shard A, not block A. For block B, they fetch all the receipts generated by applying the transactions from block A for shard A and include them into the chunk for. There's a lot of spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes. Sorry, it's tough to go through. Include them for shard A and block B. Once such chunk is generated, the chunk producer for A produces its erasure-coded version and all the corresponding one-part messages. The chunk producer for A knows what block producers maintain the full state for what shards. For a particular block producer for chunk producer A includes the receipts that resulted from applying transactions in block A for shard A that have any of the shards that the block producer cares about as their destination in the one-part message when they distributed the chunk for shard A in block B. See figure 17 that shows receipts included in the one-part message. Fine. I mean, fine enough, I suppose. Receiving the receipts. Remember that the participants, both block producers and validators, so they're saying participants because they're saying all of them, do not process blocks until they have one-part messages for each chunk included in the block. Thus, by the time any particular participant applies the block B, so this is the one in the second block, and the second shard as well, they have all the one-part messages that correspond to chunks in B. B is after A. And thus, they have all the incoming receipts that have the shards the participant maintains state for as their destination. When applying the state transition for a particular shard, the participants apply both the receipts that they have collected for the shard in the one-part messages as well as all the transactions included in the chunk itself. So they're not only caring about the receipts in the one-part messages, but they also want all the new transactions that are in the chunk. So they're getting all the receipts and all the transactions out of the new chunk. And here's a diagram of it, what we just talked about. Handling too many receipts. It is possible the number of receipts that target a particular shard in a particular block is too large to be processed. The overhead's too much, you can't get it. For example, consider figure 19 in which each transaction in each shard generates a receipt that targets shard 1. By the next block, the number of receipts that shard 1 needs to process is comparable to the load that all the shards combined processed while handling the previous block. So this is just giving an example of how in the next block, instead of only having 10 receipts, because there's 10 transactions. There's actually 100 incoming receipts from the in this new block. So if all the receipts target the same shard, the shard might not have the capacity to process them. Okay, so to address it, we use a technique similar to that used in quark chain. Specifically for each shard, the last block B and the last shard S within that block from which the receipts were applied is recorded. When the new shard is created, the receipts are applied in order first from the remaining shards in B and then in blocks that follow B. So first come, first serve. You fill each chunk full. You fill the chunk with what you can, go to the next block and continue. Under normal circumstances with a balanced load, it will gradually result in all the receipts being applied, and thus the last shard of the last block will be recorded for each chunk. This is kind of how I would say that the mempool now is in Ethereum. You send all these transactions out with a certain amount of gas fee, and the miner just pick them up later. If it's full, if the state's full, if the transaction log or whatever for Ethereum is full and the block space is full on Ethereum, your transaction will go through the next time. So same theory, if the block space is full for this shard and you can't get your transaction in, it'll go through the next time. But during times when the load is not balanced and a particular shard receives disproportionately many receipts, this technique allows them to be processed while respecting the limits on the number of transactions included. This is where I think EIP 1559 can be useful in other chains to try and get some sort of algorithmic load balancing. Because in times of peak, use, things will just cost more to move between shards. And then, people will, okay, I don't want to move between shards today, I'll wait till tomorrow. And so, and if there's no traffic on the highway, the price should come down a little bit. Just keeping things algorithmic when possible and when safe. No, okay, I need water. Sorry. Note that if such unbalanced load remains for a long time, which the delay from the receipt creation until application can continue growing indefinitely, which is obviously not like what you'd want. EIP 1559 would solve something like that, I suppose, potentially. I think we worked out a scene, of course. One way to address it is to drop any transaction that creates a receipt targeting a shard that has been as a processing delay that exceeds some constant, 1 epoch. And then here, an epoch is like a day or two or a couple of days. So that makes sense. If a shard's overloaded, you just can't use the shard. I don't like that as much because you're removing the ability for people to use a shard they might need to use. So let them, arguably I'd say let them use it, but just have the fee be higher. And so configure figure 20 by block B. The shard 4 cannot process all the receipts, so it only processes receipts originating from up to shard 3 in block A and records it in block C. The receipts up to shard 5 in block B are included, and then by block D, the shard catches up, processing all the remaining receipts in block B and all the receipts from block C, which is basically how most things work now in like most blockchains. 3.7. Chunks validation. A chunk produced for a particular shard or a shard block produced for a particular shard chain in the model with shard chains can only be validated by and this is the diagram we just talked about, how chunk 4 is overloaded but eventually catches up. Participants that main the state. They can be block producers, validators, or just external witnesses that downloaded the state and validate the shard in which they store assets. Makes sense. Like light clients, pretty much. In this document, we assume that majority of the participants cannot store the state for a large fraction of the shards. It is worth mentioning, however, that there are sharded blockchains that are designed with the assumption that most participants do have capacity to store the state for and validate most of the shards, such as Quark chain. and I guess Ethereum too. Since only a fraction of the participants have the state to validate the shard chunks, it is possible to adaptively corrupt just the participants that have the state and apply an invalid state transition. And yeah, I think they're trying to do some really cool stuff in here, but cool stuff comes with cool hacks too. Multiple sharding designs were proposed that sample validators every few days, and within a day, any block in the shard chain that has more than 2/3 of signatures of the validators assigned to the shard is immediately considered final. So using just randomly, if this random block has more than 2/3 of the weight, it's final. With such an approach, an adaptive adversary only needs to corrupt um, just over 2/3 of the active validators. Wait, 2n the block producers. Um, yeah, 2/3 of the block, a little more than 2/3 of the block producers of the validators in a shard chain to apply invalid stations. Yes. So if you had over 2/3 of the validators in that specific state, and then you were the random. Oh, this is the random one. Oh, we're gonna attest to the wrong state and make a lot of money. So, which is likely hard to pull off. It is not a level of security sufficient for a public blockchain. Agreed. As discussed in section 2.3, the common approach is to allow a certain window of time after a block is created for any participant that has state um, to challenge its validity. Such participants are called fishermen or watchtowers or whatever you want to call them. For a fisherman to be able to challenge an invalid block, it must be ensured that such a block is available to them. The data availability in Nightshade is discussed in section 3.4. In Nightshade, once a block is produced, the chunks were not. In Nightshade, when a block is produced, the chunks are not validated by anyone other than the actual chunk producer. In particular, the block producer that suggested the block naturally didn't have the state for most of the shards and was not able to validate the chunks. When the next block is produced, it contains attestations of multiple block producers and validators. But since the majority of block producers and validators do not maintain state for most shards as well, a block with just one invalid chunk will collect significantly more than half of the attestations and will continue being on the heaviest chain. To address this issue, we allow any participant that maintains the state of a shard to submit a challenge on chain for any invalid chunk. So now you could have these fishermen or watchtowers looking out for any invalid block. So basically, if you hold the state of something and you care about that state, you are someone who should be looking out and providing validity, which I think is really cool because this means that light clients, it seems, who have no near tokens at all, could still be able to, hold state that they find important and validate chunks that they find important. And then if they found a chunk that was invalid in the state they cared about, I would assume that. So if I care about the mint base, the entire mint base contract state, every single contract in mint base, and someone was trying to put up an invalid state there, and I was like, "Hey, no, don't do that." I would get paid a little bit, I think, in these systems, which would be great as well, right? To get paid for being a fisherman or a watchtower. You're going fishing, you're catching the fish. 3.7.1 State validity change. Once a participant detects that a particular chunk is invalid, they need to provide a proof that the chunk is invalid. Since the majority of the network participants do not maintain the state for the shard in which the invalid chunk is produced, the proof needs to have sufficient information to confirm the block is invalid without having the state. We set a limit S, or limit of state, of the amount of state in byte that a single transaction can cumulatively read or write. Any transaction that touches more than that limit state is considered to be invalid. Remember from sections 3.5 that the chunk in a particular block B only contains the transactions to be applied, but not the new state root. The state root included in the chunk in block B is the state root before applying such transactions, but after applying the transactions from the last chunk in the same shard before the block B. Yes, a malicious actor that wishes to apply an invalid state transition would include an incorrect state root in block B that doesn't correspond to the state root that results from applying the transactions in the previous chunk. We extend the information that a chunk producer includes in the chunk. Instead of just including the state after applying all the transactions, it instead includes a state root after applying each contiguous set of transactions that collectively read and write this limit bytes of state. So they almost have little checkpoints. It's like instead of trying to play an entire game at once and only having one life and then you die and it's like, oops, I died. It seems like they have these limits for the bytes of state changes. And within these, every so often, you must include a state root for this much code. So this much code went through. This much changes went through. This is the state for the changes. This much change went through. This is the state for the change. This is the state root for the changes. With this information for the fisherman to create a challenge that a state transition is applied incorrectly, it is sufficient to find the first such invalid state root and include just that limit bytes of state that are affected by the transaction between the last state root, which was valid, and the current state root with the Merkle proofs. So basically, we're breaking up these checkpoints and having all these save locations. If something was wrong with one of those save locations, it's very easy to know because instead of looking up the whole thing, you're looking at just one little, like the fisherman or the watchtower can go, oh, no, that little save seems to be wrong, instead of trying to look up the whole thing. Then any participant can validate this and confirm that the chunk is invalid. Similarly, if the chunk producer attempted to include transactions that read and write more than that limit for the challenge, it is enough to include the first these bytes. It touches with the Merkle proofs, which will be enough to apply the transactions that were supposed to be applied and confirm that there's a moment when an attempt to read or write beyond that byte was made. So if you try and play longer than you're supposed to play and don't save in time, someone will go, okay, well, you were supposed to save here, so here's the correct information. And because you went past that save, it's very easy to know the game data was supposed to be, say, 2,000 bytes, and you played till 3,000 bytes. So we're only going to actually go to the first 1,000 bytes, and we know you did something wrong because you put in more bytes. So now 3.7.2, I'm getting kind of tired, and I have 10 more pages. So I'm going to end it off here for the day, or maybe I'll do it a little more later, but I have like trivia later on and some other stuff going on. But hopefully I'll finish this tomorrow. To anyone that might have come in and watched this, I appreciate it. Thank you for letting me have this time to talk about random stuff and random consensus protocols. This was about an hour, 59 minutes so far. So that's kind of my goal, is to keep it about an hour. Who knows? Maybe I'll play some Gods Unchained for a bit. When I go through a paper, talking it out loud and going through it like that, an hour is a long period of time. My brain's just getting foggy. Once I get to about an hour and a half, 2 hours, I get dead tired. And so I used to do 40 hours a week of research, which was really fun, but crazy. But yeah, hope everyone has a wonderful day. Until tomorrow. Yeah, Chloethedev out.